This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're still in Dominaria United season, we're barely in it actually, and I'm about 20 drafts into the format, and also have done a couple of sealed. I'm practicing sealed because I'm playing in the qualifier weekend, which I think is next weekend actually. So yeah, I've been playing a bunch of limited to get ready for that event, and just because I like playing limited. And so, this many drafts in, there's already some cards I've noticed that are performing better or worse than I expected them to. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 of each of those, 5 cards that are better than I expected, and 5 cards that are worse than I expected. And then we'll do a crack a pack at the end, talk about, what, as usual, what I would first pick out of the pack and how I'm feeling about the cards in it. So first though, let's dive in, and first we will look at 5 cards that are overperforming, 5 cards that are better than I expected them to be. So the first of these overperformers I want to talk about is Mantle Chaplain. So this card is awesome, and I thought it was going to be good in the set review. I gave it a B as like a build-around card. So I thought it was going to be good. I thought it would be sort of the premier win condition for the defender decks in the format. That has turned out to be true, but it's even better than I expected, and the floor on the card is also better than I expected it to be. I gave it sort of a D in your regular deck, but a B in, a defender deck. And, it turns out the floor of 4 mana, 0/3, and a 1/1 flyer, that's not great. But that being the fail case on the card, the absolute worst thing it's going to be, it's a little better than I expected it to be, to get those 2 bodies, even one with defender. It really makes a difference. It can help you stabilize in situations. And we're talking about the fail case here, and it's really not that hard to build around it some. It's particularly nice to just combo it with Shield Wall Sentinel, which can search it up. So, if you do that and then you play the Chaplain, you're going to get 2 flyers. And then, the other great thing about it, and I said this in the set review, is that it pays you off for defenders already in play, and then it pays you off for other defenders you play. And that makes it even better than, the 2 mana 3/3 wall that damages the opponent, or the Coral Colony that can mill the opponent. The Mantle Chaplain is the really great one, and it's kind of, for me, really moved up in my pick order in terms of pack 1, pick 1. I think you can take it over a lot of rares and most commons and uncommons in the set. And when I say rares, I mean mythics too. Yes, it's a build around, but it's not that hard to make it work. The defenders are around, the deck is pretty synergistic, and you can build a fairly controlling defensive deck that can just win the game with this Mantle Chaplain nonsense. And so I already thought it was going to be good, but it's been even better than I expected, partly because the floor isn't quite as bad as I thought it would be, and partly because the ceiling, I guess, is even higher than I expected it to be. It's easier to put the deck together. So it is a great card. Don't sleep on it. And I'm sure by this point you've all experienced losing the game to Mantle Chaplain, or winning games with Mantle Chaplain. So, maybe you don't need me to tell you this, but it has been really good. Next up, I want to talk about Impedance Momentum. So this is one I did not think would be particularly good, and it has been better than I expected. I didn't like the fact that it's only sort of partially, it temporarily removes a creature in essence, and it doesn't even fully remove that creature. If that creature has a static or activated ability that doesn't involve tapping, they can still use it. But luckily for me, the blue-red tempo aggro deck, or sometimes white's in there, sometimes it's blue-white. Either way, if you're an aggressive spell deck, and generally the better ones are red, because in red you have access to 3 different 2-drops at common and uncommon that all give you a huge payoff for casting spells. You've got the Electrostatic Infantry, you have Balmor, the Signpost uncommon, and then you have the 2 mana 1/2 who you can kick but gets +2/+0 from spells. And, going through that deck, especially in the archetype guide, I was like, this deck can really run away with things if it just plays a couple of these 2-drops. And that's true, and Impede Momentum is actually nice in that deck. So it's sort of a build-around card. I don't think you play it in any other decks. People will say, it's removal basically, etc. It really isn't. If you don't get a trigger for casting it on top of what it already does, in your already aggressive deck. So getting a blocker out of the way and then triggering 2 or 3 cards at the same time is a big deal. Really allows you to get in for a lot of damage, but there's not another deck in the format that can do that really in blue. Like I said, the blue-white to some extent can do it, but it doesn't get as many spell triggers as the blue-red deck does. So it's really very narrow where you can play it, but having 1 or 2 of them in that blue-red deck is perfectly fine, and even reasonably happy to have 1 or 2 in that deck if you've got the right cards with all the spell triggers. Oh, another really good aggressive 2-drop for the deck, by the way, is the 2/1 who becomes unblockable. It doesn't need the momentum to tap something down, but it is yet another 2-drop that can just snowball in the early game and get you in for a bunch of damage. So Impede Momentum has been quite good in that one particular deck, anyway. Next up, there's Monstrous War Leech. So I underrated this one in the set review. My thinking about it was that the average mana value in this format is lower than usual because of Kicker. And while I do think that's true overall, because I don't need to jam as many 6 or 7 costed things at common and uncommon, because you can just make a 5-drop that has a Kicker for 2, so it does a bigger thing later. The thing I didn't think about when I was grading and thinking about Monstrous War Leech in the format was the cycle of commons. There's a common in every color that gets a reduced cost based on X, whatever it is, whether it's the one whose power is reduced by the number of spells in your graveyard, that's the Tolarian Terror, or the one whose cost is reduced by the power of your creatures. All of these have really high mana values, and they're common, and you end up playing these in most decks. When you can get them in the format, they're perfectly solid or better. And Tolarian Terror is really the best friend of the War Leech because the War Leech has a blue kicker, and the Tolarian Terror likes things in the graveyard. But either way, if you can get a deck that has a few War Leeches and a few Terrors, like the combo is pretty gross, and that's just a common and an uncommon. They just go really well together. But you can even pair the War Leech with other colors too, like I said. Every color has an expensive spell that can have its cost reduced, but the War Leech always sees it as its mana value printed on the card. So the War Leech is bigger more often than I expected it to be. Again, it is better in blue-black than anywhere else, but you can play it in other decks too. Next up, there's Keldon Strike Team. This is another card I was pretty high on. I think I gave it a B- in the set review, and I think for me, it's another one that's sort of a build around. You have to be in red-white to take full advantage, but that deck is pretty good at going wide and has lots and lots of payoffs for doing it. And the fact that the Strike Team can give you 3 bodies is a huge deal. I really love, everything about the Strike Team too. Sure, it's great if you're the beatdown. It works well with, I always want to say crewing, enlisting creatures because it has haste. Its friends have haste, so they can enlist right away. All of that works well. But the thing that really seals the deal for me on how good the Strike Team is it's even good when you're behind. And, that's not immediately something you might think of when you look at Keldon Strike Team because, hey, it's, 3 bodies with haste. But the fact that you get 3 bodies out of this one card actually can help you stabilize. You can buy some time. Chances are good you will have good blockers for when your opponent attacks you. So it's not only good when you're ahead, which is when it's really good, especially if you have an effect that pumps your whole board, but it's also good when you're behind. And for me, it has the power level of a really good uncommon for me in this format so far. And I have enjoyed the card a lot. It is quite good. And then the last card I want to talk about is Destroy Evil. So this is one that I think I just sort of saw a modal card that has 2 options. It seems sort of narrow and didn't think about the card as much as I should have in the set review. I didn't say it was bad. I think I gave it a C, and it's not way better, but I think you end up running 1 copy of these in most of your white decks, and you feel fine about it. It's probably more like a C+, that first copy. There are enough targets for it in the format. Your opponent frequently has something with toughness 4 or higher. There are a decent number of enchantments in the format. Blowing up sagas isn't the greatest because most of them give them value already, but you can do that. It's good at destroying all the Oblivion Ring effects in the format. And yeah, it has enough targets in every deck, basically, against every deck in the format, that it is worth running one of, and it is better than I expected, and not just sort of a, throwaway mediocre card that you play in your deck sometimes, but it's one that you usually don't cut from your deck. All right, now let's talk about some cards that are worse than I expected them to be. So I'm mostly sticking to commons and uncommons with this list. Obviously, I think that's the most useful because you'll see these cards all the time. But I do want to talk about one rare here because I think I was so wildly wrong about it that I think I need to mention it here so that people, if they are making the mistake of taking this card highly, they stop. And that is the phasing of Zhao. So, I got kind of intoxicated by this card's capability as sort of a one-sided board sweeper. Because I like the idea that you could phase your things and then blow up the whole board. But, it doesn't line up that well, for one thing. You don't always have time to do Chapter 1 and 2. And then any sort of board sweeper that then just replaces all the creatures on the board with 2/2s also isn't great, especially in this format. Like if you're up against a red-white deck that just played a Keldon Strike team, it's not like your phasing of Zhao helps you. Like, in fact, it's probably an upgrade overall to give them 3 2/2s instead of a 3/1 and 2 1/1s. So there are a lot of board states where it just doesn't do what you need it to. Even, if your opponent's already wider than you are, they're still going to be wider than you after you cast it. If your opponent is going tall, like with 1 or 2 big creatures, it can work out. But it just doesn't line up that way often enough. And yeah, you can try to save your best creature and all of that. But the fact that your opponent still gets all these 2/2s means that saving your best creature won't always make a difference. There are times where you can line this up and it's great. It does insane stuff. Like if your best creature is a flyer and you get rid of everything except what they have on the ground. But these situations are corner cases that don't work out very often. If you try to play the phasing of Zhao, which I've done a couple of times sort of to test it out, and it always felt bad. Like in my hand, it's one of those cards where I just had it and I'm like, this just doesn't do anything. And I've also, not been super impressed with it when other people play it, and it doesn't have the best numbers on 17 lands. So I said it was a pretty good card in the set review that you can take with a first pick, and I think it's probably unplayable. It might not quite be that bad, but it's probably like a D. It does have a big effect on the game, sort of. Part of the problem is that big effect doesn't actually have a big effect on the game, if that makes sense, because whoever has the most creatures still has the most creatures, and that is not really how you want to be doing it. So, when you play a Wrath, you want your opponent who has more creatures to suffer more than you do, and that doesn't happen here. So, yeah, not very good. So, other than that, we got commons and uncommons. The next one I have is Djinn of the Fountain. I thought this looked like it would be a pretty good uncommon. I like, modality is always fun. I like spell triggers. I like spell decks. But, it's a 6-mana 4/4 flyer is just such a bad baseline. And the effects it has, this isn't a bad card, I should say. I just thought it would be like a good card, and it's just an okay card. But I thought the effects would be nice. You get, prowess basically with a +1/+1, until end of turn. You can blink it, you can scry 1, and these effects are all nice. But the cost of this card, like, you frequently find yourself in situations where tapping out for this thing feels miserable because your opponent's board just doesn't care about this 4/4. And yeah, it's fine, especially in like the blue-black deck, the more controlling of the 3 spell decks in the format. It's not very good like in blue-red. That's part of the problem too, is that deck is interested. Why would it ever play this like really expensive spell payoff when it can just jam in all these cheap ones at 2 mana? So yeah, it just doesn't really line up well for the format. And it's fine, but it's not good, like a nice uncommon like I expected. It's a card you cut a decent chunk of the time, and it really probably only has one home basically in blue-black. It's okay in blue-green too, but yeah, it's not as good as I expected. Next, I want to talk about Hammerhand. So this is a card I was kind of excited about because it was pretty decent and limited last time we saw it, but it's just weird in this format for a few reasons. For one thing, there's no real aura payoff or anything in this format at the lower rarities. There are a couple once you get into rare. I guess it's just one, but you have the 6 mana. Is it a 5 mana 4/4 with lifelink, vigilance, and first strike that can grab an aura from somewhere? Obviously, when you combo those together, that's kind of absurd, and you'll probably play this when you have one of those, and you're an aggressive deck. But the problem is, if these creatures actually had real prowess, and real prowess is non-creature spell, period, then this would be pretty good. But all these cards I've been talking about that are good in the blue-red deck, for example, they don't have prowess. They need instants and sorceries. And so, yeah, this can sort of help you get going and attack through your opponent. But because it doesn't, trigger any of the things you want to be triggering, like every turn if you're an aggressive spell deck, and even in the red-white deck, like you'd rather just, instead of putting this on one of your creatures, you would generally rather be going wider so that your go wide payoff does the thing, and this doesn't do that either. So it doesn't line up with what the aggressive decks in this format want to be doing for the most part. Doesn't have any real synergy in the format, and that has made it, instead of like a decent card in your aggro deck, I generally don't find myself playing it. You really need to have a good reason to, and you usually won't have it. Next up, there is Sheoldred's Restoration. So I thought this would be pretty good. I thought, hey, it's a cheap reanimation spell, and it has Kicker, where, you gain some life, so it can help you stabilize. And there are some decks it works in, but I thought it would be sort of a consistent good performer in like black-white and black-green. It's not. Like, yeah, those decks mill themselves and stuff, and that's good, and they sacrifice things. But it's pretty hard for you to want to pay 4 mana to reanimate something when you don't kick this. And like taking the damage usually isn't worth it, and the thing you have in your graveyard often isn't worth it. And part of the problem with that is Kicker, because a lot of the creatures that end up in your graveyard, are actually kind of small as a base form, and when you reanimate them, you don't get to kick them. So that is a problem. And then when you do kick it, sure, you gain some life, that's cool, but you pay so much mana that what you reanimate isn't worth it either. So both halves of this card, kicked and unkicked, have really underperformed, and I haven't been impressed with them at all. I don't really think you can play this in this format. And so instead of being like what I thought was going to be a nice uncommon for a couple of decks in the format, this just doesn't have a home, really. And then the last card I want to talk about is Founding the Third Path. Again, I like spell decks. Sometimes I get carried away with how excited I am about a card. And this is another example of that. I knew, if you go back and listen to what I said about this card, I was like, you don't get a real card out of Chapter 1. Chapter 1's not going to do anything for you most of the time. Yeah, maybe it gives you a discount because you play this in turn 2 and then you get to cast a thing. But part of the problem is when you have no mana available to cast a thing in your hand already, it probably doesn't do anything, because like the 1 and 2 mana instants and sorceries in the format, if you're casting them with this effect, they won't have targets usually. Otherwise, you can just cast them probably, in which case that effect is irrelevant. But I knew that Chapter 1 was going to be kind of underwhelming, but it's even worse than I expected. Chapter 2, meanwhile, I thought it would be nice for setting things up, like Tolarian Terror and stuff like that, and it kind of is, but it's not great. And then Chapter 3, again, you don't get, in this case, you do get a full card back, but it takes you getting to Chapter 3 and to finally go get a one, you've invested one card, this Saga, and you've gotten one card back. That's what you've finally gotten. And sure, you can start at Chapter 3, but the problem there is you have to cast the spell, and you have to pay the mana for the spell still. So ultimately, the idea is Chapter 2 loads the graveyard, Chapter 3 gives you a spell, and it can do it. But most of the time, this just isn't doing what you want it to, and it also suffers from both the blue-red and the blue-white deck are not really interested in doing this sort of slow kind of thing with their spells. The blue-black deck is a little more interested, but even there, I haven't been impressed with it overall. It just doesn't give you enough for the investment and or the time, whichever option you choose, you kind of feel like you're not getting enough back, and that makes it not such a good read-ahead Saga. So those are the 5 cards that are better than I expected and worse than I expected about 20 drafts into the format. I'll keep you updated on my thoughts. Of course, near the end of the format, I'll have sort of a fully formed, this is what I got wrong in the set, full stop, but this is sort of a middle of the format version of that. So That does it for our main topic this week, but I do want to also do a crack-a-pack as we do. So we'll hop into doing one of those now. We'll look at a pack, we'll look at every card in it, I'll tell you how I feel about them, and then I'll tell you what I would first pick. All right, so here is our pack. Our first common is Colossal Growth. This has been a nice trick in the format. I mean, especially, if you're in red-green, you play one of these basically always. You're usually a relatively creature-heavy deck. Maybe not the most aggressive deck, but you definitely attack with creatures, and some of them are big, and Colossal Growth is great with them. But definitely not something you want to be first picking. Stall for Time. It's been nice too. It's a nice little tempo card. Sometimes it helps you find a way to push lethal through in like the blue-white deck. And, it always replaces itself, always taps things. It's definitely super good when you kick it and just okay when you don't. But it's an all right. I mean, it's a fine card, especially in like full-blown blue-white. Again, not something you really want to first pick, though. It's kind of a role player that you'll play like one of in that deck, but you don't really go after that hard. Elfhame Worms next, kind of in the same category of the other two. This might be the worst of the three of them, but they're all solid playables. Vigilance and Trample gives you a pretty good way to pressure your opponent on a lot of boards while not giving up, protecting yourself. I've had that line up pretty nicely a few times. But again, you don't really want to take it very highly. Flowstone Kavu's next, and I think this is sort of a step above these first three commons that are all fine, but this is one that I think is a little better than fine. A 3-mana 2/3 with Menace is nice. Its ability to pump its power allows it to crack in for 4 sometimes. Works well with Enlist. It's kind of fun to have in any of the aggressive decks in the format, like red-white or blue-red, to a lesser extent red-green, because it just, 2 bodies have to account for it. It can really help you push through damage. So right now, that's what we would first pick. I don't love the idea of first picking a Flowstone Kavu, so hopefully we do better than that. Tattered Apparition is next. This is not very good. It has really bad base stats as a 4-mana 2/2 flyer, dies to like all kinds of things that are way cheaper. And it can pump itself and all that. And in the extreme or in the mid to late game, that can be nice, but it's pretty mana intensive. It's just, a very mediocre creature that I think is the worst card in the pack so far. Tidepool Turtle. If you're in sort of a grindier domain type deck in the format, this isn't terrible, but the problem is those decks often just run, walls that have some synergy with other wall stuff in the format. And Tidepool Turtle is like this defensive creature that isn't a wall in this format. And sure, it scries, but it's expensive to do. Part of the problem is there's all these things in the format that can tap it down or get it out of the way or bounce it or whatever so that these aggro decks can just keep doing their thing anyway. And so you need it to do something more than what it's doing, and it just doesn't. So don't like it either. Probably worse than the Apparition. All right, Keldon Strike Team is next. This is definitely what we would pick, and I don't hate the idea of first picking it. I think it's a solid first pick. It is a card that you sort of do need to be in red-white to fully unlock it, of course. But, you can play it in a deck like red-green and, have a couple of duels, and it's okay. And it has an okay floor, as a 3-mana 3/1 with haste. But when it gives you the 3 bodies is when it feels really great. So red-white's where you need it. It's sort of a gold card, but it's powerful enough you take it anyway. Shadow Prophecy's next. This has been a decent card selection spell. It also loads your graveyard if your domain's high enough. You run one of these in a lot of black decks in the format, but you don't take it early. You don't need to. There's usually more of them to go around than anybody actually needs. Next up, there is Captain's Call. This is a card. It was really interesting in the set review because in a lot of formats, this would just not be good. We're used to seeing a better rate. Like if we're paying 4 to make 3 1/1 tokens, we usually do it at instant speed, like with Sprout Swarm. There's a couple of others out there. Either that or we pay 3 and we feel like it's a good rate, like Hordling Outburst. So paying 4 is not a great rate at sorcery speed, but it was pretty clear, it was pretty obvious to everyone who really looked at the set that there's so many go-wide payoffs in this format that this is going to overperform here, and it has. It is a solid card in red-white. It especially does work. It's good in blue-white too, though. Both of those decks really like to have 1 to 2 of these. There's enough payoffs for making these soldier tokens that it's really nice. Sort of like the strike team, it's also not terrible when you're behind. It's not quite as good. Like a 3-1 body is just so much better than a 1-1 because the 3-1 can maybe trade with something significant, but it is still okay when you're behind, and yeah, works, has a lot of synergy in the format. That said, you don't first pick it either. I think right now, if I would go Keldon Strike Team, Flowstone Kavu, Captain's Call, I guess, right now is the order I would go in. Next up, we have Deathbloom Gardener. You know, this has been a little bit of an overperformer. I didn't love the card in the review because it just seems so weird, like a 3-mana 1/1 with Death Touch that taps for mana. And in my head, I was like, I mean, you're going to tap this a lot, so why does it matter that it has Death Touch? And turns out it's kind of a nice late game effect to put on a Mana Dork because suddenly it can block anything. Sure, block anything and kill it. And sure, it dies very, very easily. But that late game upside, I was a little too pessimistic. Didn't think about that. Like, you know, in the late game, this is better than Llanowar Elves, as crazy as that is. And because it can trade for things. But yeah, it's not amazing either. Definitely Keldon Strike Team. Next up, we're on Lagomos. This is a nice signposting common for Black-Red. Cranks out a 2/1 every turn with Trample and Haste. There are lots of little things you can do with that. It's another card that helps you go wide in a format with decent number of go wide payoffs. Sometimes you can even trigger the tutor effect. Not that I've seen anybody do that, either me or my opponents at this point, but it is a nice signpost. I think I still take Strike Team over it, though. I think I like Strike Team more. Next up, though, we have Tail Swipe. This 1 green mana fight spell is quite good. You can treat it as just a straight up fight spell if you decide to cast it as an instant. And green has enough beefy creatures in the format that, you know, that does some work. But the fact you can also get +1/+1 out of it during a main phase is nice. It allows a lot more of your creatures to kill a lot more of theirs. And, you know, it's an exaggeration, of course. But it feels like Swords to Plowshares often enough where you pay 1 and kill their thing that is a real problem, that I think I like it a little more than Keldon Strike Team. We've got Linebreaker Baloth next. This thing is pretty good. It's one of the better enlist creatures because it can't be blocked easily by smaller things, so it can really rumble in there. You can just, you know, if your opponent has small things in play only, it's kind of fun to sort of, you know, put more power into this thing when it can't be blocked and, you know, let your other creature enlist instead of attacking. But I think I would take Tail Swipe and Strike Team and Lagomos ahead of it. And then our rare is a bomb. It is Defiler of Instinct, a 4-mana 4/4 with first strike. You know, like this whole cycle, it decreases the cost of one of your spells every turn if you want it to, and you pay 2 life for that 1 color of mana instead. And then it has a nice trigger. In this case, when you cast permanents, it pings things. And that is pretty powerful. You know, you can hit your opponent with it at worst. Sometimes you can really wreak havoc on the board. And it actually combos pretty well with the fact that it has first strike. That is what we take in the end. I think it goes Defiler, Tail Swipe, Strike Team, Lagomos. And after that, probably the Baloth, I guess. Yeah, pretty strong pack overall. It is kind of a bummer, you know, when you take the Defiler, there are 2 good red cards in this pack. At least one of them sort of gold in the Strike Team. And then there's, you know, the Kavu too. But you still take the Defiler, and yeah, it's just very, very good. All right, so that will do it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I'll be back next week. We'll talk some more about Dominaria. Depending on how many drafts I get in and stuff, it may be time to do my archetype ranking for the format. We'll see. Definitely be talking about some more Dominaria United, though. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future editions of this series and lots of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past editions of this series or see my set review for Dominaria United, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.